to the way you think and the way you permit yourself to think. And that is absolutely what happened to me. And I would always brag about the arrangement I had on Fox, which was real, which I said, it's your channel. If you don't like it, what I'm saying, pull me off, but you can't control what I say while I'm on the air. And they live by that. But I never, and I always think of myself as a strong person and a free man, and I'm gonna say what I think, and to a large extent I did, but I never appreciated how that affected the way I allowed myself to think. And the second I left, and what a blessing that was, and of course, most of your blessings come in disguise. You don't realize what they are for when they happen, but that really was a huge blessing for me. And yes, I mean, there were all sorts of things. I mean, for one thing, just the structure of television, not just the company I work for, but all of them.
Tucker Carlson on the mainstream media, not a surprise, I think, to a lot of us who try to avoid the mainstream media and seek out alternative sources of information or entertainment, discussion of ideas. The traditional media does have a very top-down, authoritarian command structure, and that's the great thing about YouTube and Twitch and podcasting and all of the new media, the ability for individuals to express their point of view out to the audience, as well as simply passively receiving what the government or corporations want you to believe.
Yet the structure of cable television is inherently partisan. You can't get out of that. And so I'm happy to say almost all Democrats are bad, but I am not happy to say, and I wouldn't be honest if I said most Republicans are good office holders, because that's not true. They're not good.
That's another big thing that's bothered me about political discussions is people that treat it like a football team. They're cheering for their side no matter what. It doesn't matter the issue. They're not going to think critically about it. They'll just go to whoever their source is and do what they say, follow their point of view. You got to think independently. You got to analyze issues on their own merits. The other thing is, a lot of the time there's not a huge difference between political parties here in Canada. If you ask me, the Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, they're all sock downs playing from the same playbook. I don't see a tremendous variation in policy. Sure, there are some differences in rhetoric, and I mean, I'm not saying they're in lockstep for every single thing. There'll be some fringe wedge issues that they'll take very strong stances on, but the vast majority of policy is just assumed. It's not even in the discussion. It's not in the debate. If you challenge that consensus, then you're, a radical. You're not even worth refuting. Okay, you're just somebody to be laughed at and ignored. And this is what Don Chomsky refers to as thought control in a democratic society. They have only a very limited, narrow band of discussion allowed between the establishment left and the establishment right, but then you have very lively dispute within that band, which mimics a genuine discourse, when in reality you're leaving out so much of political philosophy and different points of view, different systems of economics, societal organization, because there are established power interests that do not want the status quo to be challenged in any way. They're making trillions of dollars. They have their economic fiefdoms that they don't want to be challenged by anybody. They certainly don't want to allow any wild card to be involved in the political process, to have political power.
Judge, but it means that statement betrays a mindset that is repugnant to me, and I feel totally free to say so, and etc. So it's not so much what I was allowed to think, it's the way that you think is heavily influenced by the structure that you live in. And I'm glad to be out of that structure, I will say.
Exactly. I want to ask you, now that you're really fully fledged member of the independent media. Welcome to the independent media. I mean, you already were that with your show on Twitter, but now you're really all in.
And tough.
Yeah, and as somebody who's really been, kind of thinking about this a lot over the past few years, I think one of the really interesting things too is just the nature, the structure of how discourse has to happen on television. And actually, the best person who's talked about this is Noam Chomsky, who obviously lots of people have disagreements with in a lot of other ways. Nonetheless, one of the things he once said that I found so insightful is that on television, you have the requirement of concision, meaning you have to make your points in 7 minutes in between commercial breaks, or sometimes you could do 15 or 17 minutes with your monologue, but still, there is a concision requirement. And what he said was that it inherently serves establishment orthodoxy, because if you want to go on TV and say something that most people already think, like, oh, Iran is really evil and Russia is terrible and China is repressive,
that is a great point of view. And, television is an incredible medium. It's so powerful, and even more so than radio, it has the ability to reach us and just to transfer so much information in such a short period of time. Well, that's such a great point that he mentions, that Chomsky said, that these, and often it's even less than 7 minutes. It's 1 or 2 minutes. You'll have a few guys talking, and this favors the establishment viewpoint that everybody already knows and understands the arguments for. If you want to make a counter argument, a solid counter argument for a sort of esoteric point of view, that requires building a huge foundation, and that's just not possible in 5 minutes or 7 minutes. I mean, I'm so excited to see this interview between Glenn Greenwald and Tucker Carlson. I mean, Greenwald in particular, I've always been a huge fan of him. One of the saner voices on the left, just completely betrayed by the Democratic establishment, because he is more of an independent thinker that's just not willing to fall in line with anything, no matter how bizarre or how much it betrays their classic beliefs. I mean, he used to be the darling of the left, and as far as I can tell, I don't think his positions have really fundamentally changed at all. He's definitely of a libertarian bent, but a strong leftist libertarian. But he's been just great in opposing militarism, opposing war. He's living in Brazil. I think this is just such a great meeting of minds. Carlson represents, I want to say, more mainstream conservative thought. I mean, maybe it's not right to even pigeonhole him like that, but there's a lot of good things about conservative thought as well.
you don't really need much time. People already think that. You just take a few minutes, you say it, everyone nods their head. But if you want to really dig in and challenge establishment orthodoxy in a fundamental way, to say, well, what about our own government and or whatever else it is that you want to do, you need time to do it. You don't have that time when you have to speak in between these commercial breaks using the attribute of concision. You did have that longer form show, but it was on your streaming service. I did it once, and I did think it enabled a different kind of conversation. But is that something as well that, looking back, do you think constrained you in what you could do?
Hugely, hugely. And it's one of the reasons that I got out of debating on TV, which I always really enjoyed. I mean, the real reason I got out was the DNC boycotted me, and so no Democratic member could come on. Along with a contentious conversation, we need more, but because they pushed each person into a box that you kind of couldn't get out of. And that form was a lot of the reason for it. So I got away, my out was writing myself like a long form 12-minute open every night where I could just think about it and really say what I wanted to say. But that's a soliloquy, not a colloquy. So I did miss the conversation. And I don't drive very much, and when I do, I just listen to bluegrass music and space out. So I've never really listened to podcasts in my whole life, and I've done a lot of them now. In the past 7 months, I've done a lot of podcasts. What an amazing form that is. Just the structure is amazing because of the lack of time limits and the conversational nature of it, and it just becomes like this incredible experience. It's like the best dinner party you've ever been to kind of thing, and I've just absolutely loved it, and I can see why, and I'm sure you have the same experience. Like the people in my world, the smart people who are really interested in what's going on and sincerely trying to figure out what's true, a lot of them listen to podcasts a lot. And I thought that was weird, but now I understand why. And so the fact that podcasts and long-form independent media are replacing, say, NBC News, which will not exist in 10 years, like no chance. That's a good thing. That's a cause for hope. We should be happy, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the first time I was on your show, or one of the first times I was on your Fox show, the segment before me, you were interviewing Adam Schiff about Russiagate, and I remember it so well because all you were doing was saying, hey, you keep asserting these things that the FBI and the CIA leaked to the Washington Post and the New York Times, but there's actually no evidence for it. Do you have evidence for it? And his response was, sounds like you should put your show on RT. And I know at some point you kind of lost the ability to interview Adam Schiff because Democrats wouldn't go on your show. We find the same thing. We've had a lot of members of Congress from the Republican Party on this show. Democratic members of Congress keep saying maybe they will, but most will never come on our show. And so you do have that ability to have this long-form discourse where you can deconstruct people's ideas even though they may not be here for you to confront it. Let me ask you about the cancellation of your show by Fox, because I know you've been asked this before.
Yes.
And I've heard you say, look, I don't know. They didn't give me a reason. I don't know for sure why. And I know that's true. But one of the things we do know for sure is that when your show is canceled, there were a bunch of Republicans in Congress in the most cowardly way possible, which is their nature, who ran to places like Politico and other outlets to say, we're so happy he's off the air because his opposition to the war in Ukraine made it so much harder for us to fund the war in Ukraine, because a lot of our voters were asking, why are you funding this war on the other side of the world when there's so many problems at home? We also know that by canceling your show, it basically removed the most vocal opponent of the top priority of the U.S. security state, which is the war in Ukraine. It left a couple of people.
I think the whole Tucker Carlson cancellation thing really goes to show that there are specific interests that the military-industrial complex, the power elites have, and they will brook no opposition to that. So when you have a voice like Carlson that's critical of the war, that's critical of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, and what is that aid? That aid is military equipment or money that's used to buy military equipment. So who's profiting is the military-industrial complex. It's these large companies like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon that produce the military equipment. They're having a bit of trouble because the war in Iraq is over, and there's no more need for more military equipment at the moment. So they need this war to be ongoing. And people say, well, doesn't Ukraine have a right to defend itself? And sure it does. I'm not in favor of the Russian invasion. I'm not supportive of it. I think it's a bad thing that Putin invaded Ukraine. But I'm also not going to waste a lot of time chastising him. I think another thing that Chomsky said, which is very important, is that our duty is to reform our society. Okay, it's easy to criticize Iran and Russia and China and Cuba. Sure, these countries are bad places doing bad things. Okay. They don't have the same level of freedom we might have here. Okay, I don't want to live there. However, my voice does nothing when I criticize Russia. Okay, I don't have the ability to affect change in Iran. However, I can, to some extremely limited degree, affect change in Canada. and maybe within, Western Bloc, because that's where I am. That's the society and the culture that I'm a part of. That's where my duty is, to reform my society, to advocate for freedom and peace and prosperity here, because that's the impact that I can have, or I can hope to have, or I can work towards having. And I think that when we look at the Russian-Ukraine situation, what we have to ask is, how do we minimize the damage? How do we minimize the loss of life? I think a lot of people are obsessed with winning that war. They want Ukraine to win, they want Russia to lose. I just want the violence to stop. I want the war to end, and ideally for it to end in a manner that is conducive to the freedom of the individuals in that area. I'm not committed to the survival or the prosperity of the Ukrainian state, as say Zelensky probably is. And I think that's at issue here. They don't want to end up ceding territory in the Donbass or any of the peripheral areas, when maybe that's the quickest path to peace. Allow Russia to claim victory, to have those bragging rights or whatever. Maybe set those areas up as like an independent region. Allow Russia to have that buffer zone of some pro-Russian province or government on their border, and whatever, so long as you have peace, so long as the war ends. I mean, there's just untold damage here to the Ukrainian society in terms of the loss of life, the loss of economic production. I'm sure the war has ground their economy to a standstill. That's a huge loss of prosperity. And this is already a poor region of the world. Things are going to be very bad there. There's a massive Ukrainian diaspora. So a lot of those refugees will never come home, and I don't blame them. I welcome the ones that have came to Canada.
But nowhere near to the extent and with the dedication that you were doing. Do you have any doubts, even though there may be other reasons? I mean, you obviously, it wasn't because of your ratings. You didn't have a scandal that brought down other Fox hosts or other people with top-rated shows before. You didn't have anything like that. So do you have any doubts that your vehement opposition to this war that most establishment Republicans support, that the U.S. security state had as their top priority, was at least a factor in why you got removed from the air?
I have no evidence, but as you said, I also have no doubt. I mean, the explanation that filtered out from wherever the explanations filter out was that I was a racist. Well, I'm actually not a racist. And everyone who knows me knows I'm not a racist. So I know it wasn't that. So it was clearly, a position that I was taking of significance that was deeply unpopular in the world that the people who run these companies live in. And I took a position on the vax that they really hated, but that had kind of passed. But the war in Ukraine had not passed. And in fact, it was a kind of a critical point. And my views were really despised. And I know that because I was told that to my face, but never asked to change them, I will say. But it was really clear, like, people don't like this at all. But I didn't stop. And I guess I kind of have to wonder, it's not even about me, and maybe you have a good hypothesis here, but like, what was that exactly? It's not as simple as, people are getting rich from the war. Of course they're getting rich from the war. And of course the weapons manufacturers love the war. They've said so. I get it. They just met with Zelensky yesterday. But that does not explain how the entire American ruling class became emotionally involved in the fortunes of the Ukrainian government. Like that's something much deeper. What was that? It was like some weird dog whistle that only sort of high-income, well-educated people could hear, and they went all in with like religious fervor. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, it's so interesting from before 2016, so before Russiagate. What you had was the bipartisan political class in Washington really attacking President Obama. It was one of the things on which they most attacked him. When Hillary Clinton wrote her book, and had criticisms of Obama, it was almost always about the fact that he was insufficiently militaristic. And particularly, she was so angry that he wouldn't confront Russia more on Syria, on Ukraine. And when Obama gave an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, Supreme neocon Jeffrey Goldberg, and Jeffrey Goldberg said, why didn't you do more to confront Putin? Obama said something that if you said now, you would be called a Russian agent. Look, we don't have a vital interest in confronting Russia in Syria. We don't have a vital interest in confronting Russia over Ukraine. Ukraine's not a vital interest to us. And yet you had both John McCain, but then the kind of pro-war Democrats, led by Hillary Clinton, demanding they confront Russia. So there's been this long-term attempt to seize control of eastern Ukraine, to take it away from Russia, to threaten Russia in eastern Ukraine relative to the border. Victoria Nuland worked with in the Clinton State Department, she's now running Ukraine, as you know, for Biden. But then I really think, and I'm wondering if you agree, that what Russiagate did, and the reason I was so opposed to it for so long, wasn't just because it was a fake, manufactured, evidence-free McCarthyite scandal from the CIA to sabotage Trump, although it was that, and that's what made it dangerous. More dangerous was the geopolitical project, was to re-inject this idea into the American bloodstream, which is always kind of latent from the Cold War, that our existential enemy is the Kremlin. Even though Obama was saying we can work with the Kremlin, George Bush said we can work with Putin, Bill Clinton said we can work with Putin, and yet they convinced a lot of Democrats that the reason Trump lost was because of Putin. They kept ratcheting up the hatred for Russia, and I think that's why you combine the kind of longstanding Republican willingness to go to war against enemies, including Moscow, with this newfound Democratic hatred for Russia, and it served this pre-existing geopolitical agenda where the United States wanted to control Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, and that meant undermining and challenging and weakening Russia.
I agree with every word of that, and I remember that interview very well. And though I don't think much of Obama, I remember thinking he seemed very reasonable in it. And Jeffrey Goldberg, of course, one of the most sinister, dishonest people in the media, in my opinion. But I remember it very well, and I remember thinking, wow, they must hate him for this. But it doesn't answer the question, like, why would you want to be at war with Russia?
This is a really good question. Is it just the insanity of the political establishment? I mean, me personally, I'd like to see people doing anything possible to avoid war with Russia so that we don't end up with World War III and humanity being sent back to the Stone Age. Perhaps it all dates back to World War II. I mean, the American and the political establishment has always been very hawkish. Maybe it's just a selection bias, and that the people who are on the more aggressive side of foreign policy generally get the support of the political establishment. They rise to the top, and they're just always in favor of military action, or often in favor of military action. We saw with the lead up to the war of Iraq, there was uniform support for the war, despite the negligible link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. And maybe these people just believe in state power. They just believe that they can use the military to make the world a better place.
Is the appeal of hating Russia? I just will speak for myself. I love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, but that's just, I like the literature of 19th century Russian novelists. I've never been there. I have no strong feelings about the country. So I think
something about the suffering of the Russian people translates to really good literature.
You can sort of see it less emotionally than maybe some in Washington. I just don't get it. Why, it's almost like they picked it off a map. Like, why Russia? We won the Cold War. That's not enough. Why do we need to just keep fighting them? I think it's very weird.
Yeah, I mean, if you go and I know, ironically, even though everyone knows you're an agent of the Kremlin, I've heard you say before you've never even been to the country. I have a couple of times, in part because my source and my friend Edward Snowden is there, but I also, find it a super interesting country. It's an incredibly beautiful and cultural place, St. Petersburg and Moscow. It, looks a lot more like Europe than it does like Asia. And Putin, for a long time, wanted a good relationship with the West. He wanted to be part of NATO, in fact, at some point. And I do think it's very strange that the United States deliberately sought out to turn Russia into an enemy. And I agree that all of the reasons aren't entirely clear. All right, let me ask you about this. One of the things that I think is so interesting that you've been doing since you left Fox is that you have been traveling around the world and not just journalistically, but almost kind of as your own political figure, have been speaking to and meeting with key figures of what's called the international populist right. You already, I think while you were still at Fox, you interviewed the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban twice, but since then you went to Brazil and interviewed the then President Jair Bolsonaro. You just were in Argentina talking to the newly elected President Javier Milei. You were just in Spain meeting with the right-wing leaders of that country, the right-wing opposition leaders. And if you look at all these figures, like doctrinally, on foreign policy, economic policy, cultural issues even, they have a lot of differences, but I feel like there's this sort of common appeal politically, this common ethos that ties them together and permits you to kind of locate them on this coherent, as a part of a coherent political movement, the international populist right. I'm wondering if you agree with that, and if so, what do you see that's common among these figures, not necessarily in terms of their beliefs, but why they're appealing to voters?
Well, I mean, I agree with the first part of your question, which is there's a lot that's different about them. I mean, to be right-wing in Spain is very different from being right-wing in Great Britain or anywhere else in Europe, in Portugal even, or in Hungary, or much less the United States. So, there are many, many differences. But here are the things that I believe they all have in common, and not just in Europe, but in Latin America and, by the way, in the world's emerging power center, which is the Gulf. And there are these things. One, there's the recognition that the post-war order is collapsing and deserves to because it no longer serves really anybody except a small group, okay? So it just doesn't work. These are old, these are aging institutions created to respond to threats that no longer exist, to govern a world that no longer exists, and so of course they need to be updated. One. Two, and the U.S. is at the center of that, so we're actually going to lose in this transition, but I'm just noting this as objectively as possible. Two, neoliberalism, which really is the global religion at this point, doesn't serve the populations of these countries very well. It doesn't increase living standards or happiness. Suicide rates are way up. And as one measure of that, wages are frozen. So it doesn't actually work. So you have two options. Either you're going to just get rid of the pretense of democracy and have some kind of authoritarian system where you just force people to eat their gruel and shut up, or you change the system. So they're all very suspicious of that. And the third thing they all have in common is kind of a mild nationalism, not a scary goose-stepping nationalism, but a literal nationalism, like a belief that my country's different. It may share interests with other countries, but they don't always overlap. And in the end, if I'm elected democratically to represent my citizens, I should do that. And I should be more loyal to their interests than to the interests of some international body like the UN or, the World Health Organization or the WEF or whatever.
I think the unifying theme is populism, is that these individuals represent popular viewpoints on the part of the public that oppose elite consensus, that challenge the intellectuals that would plan society. And I think part of the problem with these movements, say with Bolsonaro in Brazil, is that he didn't have a strong foundational belief in anything. So he sort of floundered around from policy to policy without any clear agenda, clear objective, just sort of making decision as he goes. And what you really need is some sort of core underlying guiding principles, like hopefully we're going to see with Javier Milei in Argentina. I mean, already in the very short time since he won the election, he's advocated for a number of liberal reforms, and at the same time approached in a sensible conservative manner, not wanting to upset the apple cart, but making reforms which A are beneficial and B won't incite too much opposition. It does you no good to advocate for the right policies if that's what triggers the sandstorm of social unrest and strikes and Now, at the same time, the Paranist opposition, they don't want to play their trump card too early, so they have to sort of do this dance as well. Because if they just shut down Buenos Aires, with strikes, as they're more than capable of doing, the labor unions, well in their pocket, highly organized political system or organization, but that runs the risk of just engendering more hatred towards the Paranists. They know that this isn't happening organically, that this is, a conscious reaction. So long as Javier Milei tiptoes along and implements his reform while at the same time not inciting the opposition into drastic action, I think there is a chance that he can affect some real change here. But we saw in the Netherlands, there was another right wing guy basically campaigning on he doesn't like Muslims. As far as I could tell, that was the essence of his platform. With some other center right planks like cutting taxes or whatever. But that was the real core of it. Like no more Muslims in the Netherlands. And, that's a racist and pretty objectionable policy or philosophy, I would say. But maybe it also speaks to the trouble that Europe is having with migrants. I mean, there's a lot of stories coming out of Europe about how instances of rape and sexual assault are on the dramatic rise in Sweden and other places where you do have migrants from North Africa and other countries where they don't have the same cultural norms, the same respect for women that we have here in the West. I mean, personally, from my experience, I've known a bunch of Muslims in Canada, and they all seem like perfectly fine people. So I'm not sure I get where the Dutch guy is coming from, or whether the situation's very different in Canada from in the Netherlands. I think a lot of the time it is just scapegoating, and sure, maybe there are some problems with different cultures, culture clash, societal beliefs, but those will be ironed out in the coming decades. And the reality is that there are fundamental economic and political issues that people don't want to address, so they just blame everything on the immigrants. And that doesn't mean that the immigrants or the immigration isn't causing any problems. The scapegoat can in fact be a guilty party, or maybe not a guilty party, but part of a social issue, or causing some sort of conflict within society, while at the same time this is being used to ignore or escape reality, or avoid focusing on very real issues. In Spain, there was an election which has been contested for a long time now. The far right there made electoral gains. They weren't able to form government, and the socialists took power. In Canada, the election, if it was held today, would be a conservative sweep. Like the Liberals would be lucky to hold on to their political party. There's a long time between now and the next election. Anything can happen, but it looks like Trudeau's days are numbered. So what is with this rise in right-wing populism? I think that it's fundamentally a reaction that people want to be in charge of their own lives. They reject central planning, central political planning, or central economic planning, and they reject this smug elite consensus that these intellectuals know better than we do how to live our lives. I think really it's got nothing to do with the populist conservatives. who are running. Often they're not even very ideologically oriented. They're just sort of running on whatever seems to be popular that day. But it's just more a rejection of the leftist, the social democratic agenda. Um, People are sick of apologizing for existing. You know, you've got critical race theory and all these bizarre philosophies coming out of colleges and universities these days. You know, they're denying basic facts about biology. They deny the concept of race. It's like that episode of Star Trek where Picard was captured and there were 4 lights and the guy said, no, there's 5 lights, and they just want you to kowtow to whatever they say, no matter how bizarre, to demonstrate their power. We have to deny what is self-evident, that there are 2 genders, that there are racial differences, and it's become unacceptable to even state these very basic facts about reality. We all have to just live in this bizarro clown world. So I think people are sick and tired of that, and they're sick and tired of the assault on their values, their traditional Judeo-Christian way of life, and they're just turning to anybody that's not that.
To my country, because my job is to govern my country on behalf of my country's citizens. These are very simple, moderate concepts, in my opinion, and they're not. There's nothing radical about any of that. But it's so interesting that ghouls in Washington, people who are supposed to be smart people, I'm thinking specifically of Ann Applebaum, but the entire roster at the Atlantic magazine are reportedly the smartest people in our society. And spoiler alert, they're not. Actually, they're some of the least impressive people in our society. But anyway, see that as so unbelievably dangerous and scary and radical. And of course, it's the opposite of any of those things.